First of all, it is an honor to be here, and I am extremely humbled because even though I do come from a family of physicians, so I hope that that helps. Sisters, brother-in-law, husband, 2 daughters now in medical school. I come to talk about a different science, which is a science of governance and leadership. And I was lucky enough throughout my career to be able to experience good and bad and different and horrible governance and leadership from a number of different angles, not only by consulting to companies and seeing them acquiring businesses and divesting them, but also sitting in boards, startups, global public companies, private companies, then also being a CEO myself, and then during my time as CEO of Korn Ferry Consulting, doing board assessment throughout the world. And the one thing that I can tell you, for those of you who are investors or founders or inventors, is that I have seen great products and great companies failing or not having sustainable success because of poor governance and because of poor leadership. In fact, it is the highest factor for failure of companies. No matter what size and what stage they are, you can have the best product, you're going to be successful for a few years, but if you don't put the right people in the right places at the right time, that is just not sustainable. The good news is that in the past, and if you think about how governance model theories and boards and advisors evolved, that was kind of a hobby, right? And then the regulators started to come in. So for example, in 2002, NASDAQ actually said that no company must have dependent directors or executive directors in the nominating committee if they wanted to be listed with NASDAQ, so that instituted some independence. And then in 2009, the SEC said, well, every public company must have a CEO succession plan and a succession for the successors of the CEO to be listed in the public NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange. So now you have ISS talking on say on pay. So there's more scrutiny around governance, around public companies. And then we had the big issues and the big scandals. We have Sarbanes-Oxley, and then we have all the big scandals that increase the scrutiny. But when it comes down to startups or to private organizations, there's very little regulation out there. And I have to say that it warms my heart that over the last 3 months, I've been asked to speak in VC conferences and startup conferences and incubators 3 times just in the last couple of months, which means to me that eyes are getting open to the fact that if you don't put in place great governance and great operating structure and great leadership from the beginning, you are dramatically reducing the odds of success for your company. I have to tell you a story. About 15 years ago, I was asked to speak to a group of physicians. And I told my husband I was so excited about it because it was the first time that I was going to talk to a group of physicians. And he said, oh man, nobody's going to be paying attention to you. And I said, oh, why is that? And he said, I'll tell you why. Because one is going to be thinking about the next procedure they have to do. The other one is going to be saying, this is not real science. What am I doing here? And the third one is going to be thinking, I'm only sitting in this room because my boss told me so. How long is this going to last? And what I see now is quite the opposite. So what I'd like to do in the next now 15 minutes is to talk about 3 things. First of all, we start to talk about evolution and maturity of governance model and boards. Then let's talk a little bit about size, composition. I know there are many investors in the room, and one thing that I'll tell you should be looking at is how is this company organized, how is it governed, who is in the advisory committee, board or steering committee, whatever you call. And then the last thing, let's talk a little bit about challenges, traps, and how to overcome or at least predict and anticipate them. Is that fair game? And then we'll have some time for questions. So boards started very simply because people were investing money in companies and they wanted to know how they were run. So there were no legislators, there were no organisms regulating how boards should work. as I mentioned, over the course of the last few years, not only because of the world financial crisis or Sarbanes-Oxley, or you take WorldCom and other big scandals, and the scrutiny increased quite a bit. And investors also became savvier. So stockholders are saying, hey, we want to have a say on pay of CEO. We want to understand how much equity is being given to employees at the top. Now you have the ISS with institutional investors saying, hey, if we are an institutional investor, here are some guidelines that we want to impose on you. So now there is so much more responsibility over directors, and which changes the role of director as well as investors. Why do we even think about independent directors? Because so many times, the interests of the founder, the inventor, the interests of the current operator, and the investors might be at odds, although at the end, the ultimate goal is to increase value of the company, whether you're going to sell it or you're going to continue to grow it. But you have investors, and I work a lot with private equity groups, and when you have many private equity partners on the board, that creates already a tension point with the CEO, who is hired sometimes to replace the founder to take the company to the next level, but one wants to accelerate, to sell fast, the other one is thinking long-term growth and sustainability. So many times, having one, and just one for startups, independent director on the board can make a huge difference. The other question is around who that independent director is going to be. And in the healthcare space, for those of you who followed what happened with Thurano or Outcome Health, just to cite two very recent examples, Thurano did not have one scientist on their board. Didn't have anybody who was there just to ask the right questions. It's not to probe, it's not to confront, it's not to run the company, it's just to ask the right questions. Outcome Health, I don't believe that there was any poor ill intention in terms of the data, the big data that they were analyzing and disseminating. But you know what? It was not right. And when investors discovered that, they felt that they were being deceived. So that's why having an organization like AngelMD, who is bringing all of you together to actually talk about those issues, thinking about governance and organizational models in your startups and in the companies that you're thinking to invest in, and what are the right questions to ask, can be incredibly helpful. Let's talk a little bit about size, composition, and agenda. And that's different, right? That's different for startups, for companies who are at a more mature stage, private companies, public companies, family-owned companies, founder-led companies. And I have to tell you, the whole issue of having founder and inventor-led companies that grow with a blockbuster product to a certain side and then is not successful, it's what enabled people like me throughout my career to then spot those companies and buy them sometimes, pull the person out, and then start to grow the company through digitization or through doing things that the founder, who was a great inventor, could not see from a business perspective. And understanding when is the time to make that shift, and having a board of directors around in place to say, this is the right time. There's nothing wrong with the person. There's nothing wrong with the idea to that point, but it's the time to then think about the next step is extremely important as well. As I said, public companies, which is not the focus of our conversation, are going to have that mechanism embedded in the way that boards have to do business, right? Because you have to have an executive committee, you have to have an audit committee, you have to have a nom and gov committee. Having said that, why should startups be any different? An audit committee or a compliance committee at least should be a part of any foundational board of directors or board of advisors, which is what's going to prevent many companies from doing things that they don't even know are non-compliant from a business perspective or from a tax or from a legislation perspective. They're just doing it because the mindset of the inventor and of the founder is not necessarily focused on those other issues. So think about that as well. Board size. For startups, you have the investor, You have the operators, so the executive directors or the executive advisors. As I said, at least one or two independent directors should be in place. Think about who you serve. Think about the people who are validating your science or the data behind the company. Think about diversity. And I was just having a conversation right before we started, and just look around this room. I cannot believe that the markets that you're serving are not low diversity as we see in here. So think about adding not only people who can add value from a content perspective, but who can also represent non-diverse segments in your company. They will help you to get more business. They will help you to see things from different perspectives. And they will help you to attract capital from other sources as well. Let's talk a little bit about the most common causes of disruption in boards. The first one is misalignment around the mission of the board and the strategy of the company. And that misalignment occurs usually in two ways. It's either amongst board members, as I said, if you have the investors, those of you who are in the room, the founders, the operators, and they're all looking at the business in the long term from a different perspective. We have a problem, Houston, right? The other one is between the board of advisors and the CEO and the person who is running the company. Again, I couldn't be more clear. Boards are not meant to run companies. They are meant to ask the right questions. They're meant to advise. But if you have an adversarial relationship, or if you don't establish roles clearly enough with the CEO who is there operating the day-to-day business, we will have problems. This should be a partnership relationship, not an adversarial relationship. The other type of misalignment that I've seen very commonly is around the future of the company. Are we growing to sell? Are we growing to acquire? Are we growing to IPO? What the heck are we doing here? And until you have that type of alignment, you will have serious discussions in the room that are not necessarily going to touch on alignment, but that are caused by the lack of. So we see very clearly when companies are talking about succession. So who's going to succeed the founder or the CEO? And you start to see different board members coming up with different competencies or profile requirements for the next leader. When you see people in radically different camps in terms of who they think should be leading that company, I can assure you that the misalignment is not around the individual or the role, it is around the strategy of the company. And that's the difficult conversation you need to have. Unprepared directors. One of the reasons why NASDAQ does not allow non-independent directors on the nominating committee is because we don't want to have family and friends in the board. And that's what people will do. And if they don't do that deliberately, they will tend to recruit to their board people who, one, either think or act like them, have the same style they feel comfortable with, or people who they trust and they believe are going to be loyal to them. So I know this person is not going to cause me trouble because you know what? We've been friends for several years. We know each other. I can justify him being on the board, but that's not necessarily the best solution. So my recommendation is very early in the process. I don't care if you've been a company for 20 years or just for 20 months. Start to think about your skills matrix. What kinds of competencies, experiences, skills you need in your advisory board, you need in the boardroom. And for you in the room who are investors, demand it. Demand to see if we're going to form an advisory board, what types of skills do we want to have? Do we need people with technology skills? Do we need people who are scientists or who understand big data? Or do we need people who are going to help us to raise money for the company? Which takes us to the third point, which is misalignment around expectations for directors. So the first thing I always ask when I'm being asked to sit on a board is, what do you expect from me? Why are you asking me to be a candidate for this board? Is it because of my experience technical competence, or is it because I can make connections for you, or I can help you to raise money, or is it because, in the case of some advisory boards, you expect me to be a little bit more hands-on? So for both sides, investors and board candidates, as well as operators in the room, founders in the room, that needs to be abundantly clear. Dysfunctional dynamics. So when I left Korn Ferry, I was asked to write a book. And the publishers who came to me said, would you write a book about leadership? You do all those workshops and all that. I said, nah, I don't think so. Just type leadership on Amazon. You're going to find more than 10,000 titles just on that subject matter. And so we read about all those great leaders, these phenomenal biographies, best-in-class, world-class leaders. And then I said, people get to the marketplace, and I've seen this day in, day out, and all they find is leadership. It is, right? And people ask me, I was seeing Billy talking about simplicity, and people ask, did you just come up with that? I said, no, I always thought about that. Maybe it's because I'm not born and raised in the US, and you think about words in a different way, but I thought, my goodness, I am here talking to people and coaching about leadership, and all I see is leadership. Guess what? So I wrote the book. It's actually Lessons in Leadership, and it's based on research about all the toxic behaviors you find in companies, in the workplace, and how to address them if they are your peers, your boss, your direct reports. Guess what? It doesn't stop in boards. You have the tyrant and the bully in board. You have the unaccountable. You have the land grabber. You have the manipulator. You have the political animal in the boardroom. However, for a company to function, you need to get that out of the way, right? And so understanding how your people are going to operate in the boardroom, and how do you make decisions, in particular for startups, where a much higher percentage of decisions are actually made in the boardroom, is extremely important, so that you don't have either one person dominating the conversation, or you don't have, for those who are familiar with the syndrome, the Abilene Paradox, where an entire family ends up driving 3 hours to have an ice cream, when at the end of the day, nobody wanted to, but I went because I thought that my brother really wanted to, so I'm going with him, and somebody else sees the two kids wanting to go, not that you could be our father, but I'm just pointing to people around, and say, well, maybe we should go, and then they get to the ice cream place, and they say, well, nobody really wanted to be in a car for 2 hours to get this ice cream. Guess what? That happens in boards more than you would imagine. And that's how sometimes acquisitions are pursued, divestitures are pursued, hirings of key people are pursued because nobody actually speaks up, or because only one person speaks up. How do you solve for that? Most important, and I have 1 minute to give the solutions on that. First of all, is be abundantly clear on advisors and board members and any players' expectations, time commitments, what do you want from them, what they can expect from you. There's a big age and term limit debate, which is less relevant to you in this room, but instead of saying that somebody has to step out of the board when he or she reaches a certain age, do board assessments. Even if you ask an external consultant or the HR person to do an assessment, then you will understand who is actually contributing value to the board or to the business in a meaningful way and who is not. Minimize the opportunities for conflicts of interest. I always tell this story, and by the way, you probably have some of that in the healthcare industry, when a friend of mine who has run a company very successfully, an HR company, said to me, you know, I think it's time now for me to get on a couple of corporate boards. Can you help me? And I said, sure, Kevin, what kinds of boards do you think you would qualify for? And he said, well, I have done most of my company work has been with pharmaceutical companies, so I think I should qualify for boards of pharmaceutical companies. And I said, okay, let's think about it. So are you going to close your business? He said, no, absolutely not. So let me tell you what, if you get to one of those boards of a pharma company, first thing is you cannot do business with them. Second thing is you cannot do business with any of their current competitors or anybody who could become a competitor. And he looked at me and said, I don't think that's a good idea. So very good. So to help people to think about potential conflicts of interest, right? If they are going to be fundraisers, can they actually be on the board without compromising themselves? Think about diversity and inclusion in boards. That's for me has been a life passion, a career passion, is to put more women, people of color, people with global experience in boards that can only enhance perspective. And finally, and that's the most trivial one, is meeting agenda cleanliness and effectiveness. I am sick and tired of going to board meetings where people are discussing irrelevant things when the company is actually on the board of thinking, when there are new trends and technologies coming into the marketplace that may break their business, but we're just not talking about that. And we're talking about dress code? Seriously? So think about what really matters, what should and what should not be in the agenda. What is operator's role versus board role? And I can assure you that your companies are going to be successful and last longer and longer. So I'm happy to take questions. I know I passed my time a little bit, but it's been an honor to be here.